Okay. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I've heard a lot about this seminar, and I'm flattered to be included in it. Um, some of you may or may not know that Daria was my, I think it's incorrect to say translator or research assistant for my book, because she was more than that. She was a kind of consultant and, you know, person who had good ideas more than just a normal translator. And so I'm of course was very happy to take her invitation to be here. Um, it's interesting. The origin of this book was a little bit different from the origin of my other books, in that it was suggested to me by Serhiy Plokhy at Harvard, who's, as this room will know, is the head of the Harvard University Ukrainian Institute. Um, and he came to me in, uh, you know, several years before I wrote this, and said, it was about 2010, 2011, and he said, we would like a new book on the Ukrainian famine that's designed for a general audience. And my first reaction was, why do you need that? You have Robert Conquest's book, which was, of course, the product of the same kind of process in the 1980s. In other words, it was a book that was, Conquest was the writer, but there were the Harvard Institute helped him write it. They found James Mace, who was the primary researcher on it. Many of you will know that story. And my initial reaction was, why we don't need this. And then I went, I went away and thought about it. And I went back and looked at Bob Conquest's book. And I decided that we did need a new book. And one of the reasons we needed a new book is because it's very different to write about this subject, really any subject, but particularly this subject, before and after having archives. And those of you, many of you are researchers here, you're archivists or you're historians, so you'll have some sympathy for this. It's not that the archives always tell you everything. In particular, the Soviet archives hide things. Pieces of it are missing. We all know that. It's not like you can write a perfect book even when you have archives, but you can tell it using a different kind of language. Not least, you can tell it using the language of the people who created the famine and who carried it out. And so you can see from their point of view what they were saying about it. And this may not be honest, it may not be deep in their hearts what they felt, but you can see the language that was used, and you can see how the famine was justified. And then, and also, we now have all kinds of archives. We have we have a lot more knowledge of how it affected people. We have a lot better understanding, some better understanding of numbers. And all of that means that you can write a book in a more confident way and with a clearer sense of the chronology. I mean, I found this very much with my book on the Gulag. At the time when I originally wrote that, many people said exactly the same thing. Why do we need a new book on the Gulag? We have Solzhenitsyn. And I realized that I wasn't competing with Solzhenitsyn. I will never be Solzhenitsyn. But he wrote his book. His book was based on oral history and his own experiences and letters and so on. But I could write about the Gulag using that same kind of material. And in fact, there was a lot more of it by the 1990s. But also from the perspectives of the institution and the system. And it meant that you could write it in a different and I won't say that it's more convincing, but it's maybe a more neutral way, and it's useful particularly when you're trying to reach audiences who don't have the background or they don't have the Soviet history to make sense of Solzhenitsyn or to make sense of things that seemed obvious in the 1980s. I mean, I'm right now teaching a class for the first time. I'm teaching undergraduates this fall. And part of the course is about the history of communism. It's more focused on Central Europe and between 1945 and the present. And one of the things I've realized is you cannot any longer automatically assume that people know things. You can't assume they know who Stalin was. You can't assume they know what the Soviet system was. Quite a lot of the story needs to be laid out for people, not because they're uneducated, but just because it's not part of our experience anymore. If 30 years ago it was just part of the experience, you could see the Soviet Union, there it was, and that's gone now. And so I felt that it was important to write the book in a different way. I mean, I think the other thing that's particular about my book is I started out having come off My prior book was called Iron Curtain, and it was a history of Central Europe, the Sovietization of Central Europe after the war. And this was a book about a lot of countries over a long period of time. It's a very complicated narrative. And I thought, okay, the Ukrainian famine, that's relatively straightforward. One country, 2 years, whatever, 32, 33. How hard can that be? Um, then, of course, as I began reading into the subject, as I began reading what had been, tremendous amount of archival material had already been published. And by the way, my book is really genuinely a book that is built on the shoulders of lots and lots of Ukrainian scholars. I really use the research that lots of other people have done, and I remain so grateful to them. And I've cited them all in the book and so on. But as I began reading what had been found over the previous decade, I realized that when people even when they first began, Stalin and the secret policemen who worked for him began talking about collectivization in the late 1920s. Almost immediately they began referring backwards, and they began talking about 1918. And what we need to prevent is what happened in 1918. So then I thought, okay, what happened in 1918? And I realized that the book had to begin in 1918. And so the thing that is different about my book, also different from Conquest's book and different from some of the others, is that it makes an argument about the Ukrainian famine that begins with the Ukrainian national movement of 1918. I explain what it was. I explain how it I explain the nature, a little bit of the civil war that took place in Ukraine from 1917 through 1920, 21. I explain why that civil war was so traumatic for the Bolsheviks, and why they thought they might lose it, why they were therefore so paranoid about Ukrainian nationalism, Stalin in particular, because he was the commissar of nationalities, as many of you will know. And he was personally in Ukraine at that time, and he personally experienced the fear that a Ukrainian peasant uprising might undermine the whole Bolshevik project. And when you understand that, and then you understand their attempt in the 1920s to kind of mitigate Ukrainian nationalism by Sovietizing it. They would allow the use of the Ukrainian language, and they would create a kind of Soviet Ukraine. And then how they become afraid at the end of the 1920s that hasn't really worked, and that Ukrainians are still somehow not Sovietized enough. And then you begin to be able to explain what the famine was and why it happened. And I felt that this prehistory, although it makes it a longer book, and it meant that it took me longer to write it, and I lost my 2 years, one country formula, I think it makes a much more powerful argument for against the very real prejudice in Soviet studies, particularly people who are historians of Russia, which is that it's not that the Ukrainian famine didn't happen. Nobody says that anymore. But that there was nothing particular about it. There was an all-Soviet famine. It took, people were starving all over the Soviet Union. What was special about Ukraine? And my book is an argument about why Ukraine was special. And we can maybe get into that in the subsequent conversation. But the motivation was Stalin understanding that there was a special threat from the Ukrainian national movement, and him then using the opportunity presented by the all-Soviet famine of 1931-30, that begins after collectivization, using that famine and sort of making use of this catastrophe to get rid of a problem that had been bothering him for a decade, which was the problem of Ukrainian nationalism. How do we damp it down? How do we undermine it? How do we eliminate this threat from that Ukraine poses to the Soviet state? And so the book makes that argument. It begins with 1918. It goes through the 1920s. I mean, not in great depth. Some of you will have written much more profound, deep books about that period, and my book doesn't claim to be that. But I felt that it was necessary to go through that history to explain what happens in the famine. And then the book goes into much more depth about how the famine happened, the decisions that were taken in the autumn of 1932 that were specifically directed at Ukraine. And then after that, it's also a book about what the famine was, how it affected people, how people survived or didn't survive. And then the book finishes with a couple of chapters of sort of historiography and sort of the post-history of the famine. So how did it, how was it covered up? As you know, that's a huge story and a fascinating one, and involves not just covering it up inside the Soviet Union, but covering it up internationally. And the famous story of the Western journalists, some of whom were brave and wrote about it, and some of whom weren't. And how the cover up worked, and then how the famine continued to function in the national imagination throughout the rest of Soviet history and up until the present. So that's the book is it's a slightly broader definition. It's not just about the famine; it's about the origins of Stalin's hatred of the Ukrainian nationalism, and then how the famine plays itself out in the minds of people going up to the present. So that's the outline.
Would you like to tell us a little bit more about your title? So it was Stalin's war on Ukraine. So did he win the battle, but did he lose the war?
He won the battle in 1933, and he lost the war in 1991. I mean, so the Daria knows this story already. When I originally wrote the book, it had a very gloomy ending. It's very hard when you read the documentation of the famine, when you read memoirs of the famine, or oral histories of the famine. It's very hard to come away with any bright and shining view of human nature, or almost anything positive to say at all. I mean, these are terrible stories, and there are stories of very poor and sometimes illiterate peasants dying of hunger. I mean, it's a really horrible story. And I ended the book on a somewhat gloomy, I can't remember now what the sentence was, and Daria read the ending, and she said, "You can't end it that way, because because Stalin didn't win. Stalin lost. If the goal of the famine was to destroy, the idea of Ukrainian sovereignty and the idea of Ukrainian nationality, then he lost, because in 1991, Ukraine voted for independence, and now it's a sovereign state. And not only that, it's a sovereign state that where we can study this history and talk about it openly, and remake our country, and put it back together again. So the Ukrainian famine has a happy ending.